My brother Jim was 10 years old when I was born. We couldn't have been more different. One of the photos from my childhood is Jimmy and me. He is shirtless, lying on the grass. I'm standing behind him, dressed in Mama's skirt, wearing a little hat with a pocketbook over my arm. I was perhaps 3 and he 13. That pretty much says it all. Jim died at 72. I learned that he died when my husband and I were on a boat in the Potomac with friends. The sun was setting. A gentle breeze brushed the water, creating a slight chill. I thought at the time how fitting it was that I should be on a boat when I, in my heart, said goodbye to Jim. Many of my memories are memories of Jim and the water. Jim surfed. When he was discharged from the Marines, he set out from California in a light blue 48, I think, Ford, with a surfboard strapped to the top of it. He entered the Marines when he finished high school, and he wound up lifeguarding that summer at Myrtle Beach. He carefully would wax that surfboard, borrowed some of my oil paints to paint a little logo picture of a beach and a palm tree on the front end of it. His was the first surfboard that many people had ever seen, so odd a thing it was to have on an Atlantic beach. He loved surfing. Was it because he liked the water, the thrill of surfing, or just showing off? I doubt that the two were even separable in his mind. Jim taught me how to swim. I'd made it to the age of 12 without knowing how to swim, and he was lifeguarding that summer. He took me out in the water over my head and told me to swim to the buoy. He'd throw a buoy that was tied to his arm, and I would do the overhand crawl about 10 or 15 yards to the buoy, and just as I was about to reach to grab it, he would jerk it away and cast it another 10 or 20 yards from me and say, "Swim for the buoy." Well, he did it time and time again, and I tired after a few times and just nearly sobbing begged him to stop. And he let me beg on for a few minutes before he said, "Well, stand up then." And I stood up in water up to my knees. We came back to the lifeguard stand, and he allowed me to rent the floats, 50 cents an hour it was, and umbrellas for $1 for a couple of hours and $5 a day, I think. Sometimes when he'd take a break and leave the lifeguard stand, he'd leave me in charge. Now, it's a very good thing that nobody needed a lifeguard any of those times when I was in charge of the lifeguard stand, but I'd sit in that high chair and have a purview of the beach and look at all the chairs and umbrellas that we had rented and look at my clipboard and try to figure out how much money we'd made during the day. And I'd jump down when somebody came up to rent another one. And one time I nearly killed myself falling out of that lifeguard chair. But my golly, an ex-Marine football player hero giving me that responsibility was worth every float in the water and every umbrella on the strand. Years later, when my two little girls and their mom and I would vacation down on the beach, uh, Jim owned a shrimp boat, and it served as a main element in his social life at the time. Well, he would take us out on that shrimp boat. Sometimes we go deep sea fishing, sometimes shrimping out in the Atlantic, and sometimes in the inlet, and sometimes down the Waccamaw River. Um, and I have great many memories of that. I never went with him to the Caribbean, but he would take that shrimp boat and go down there sometimes. And so, after retiring from his law practice and his position as a state solicitor, he'd go down to the ocean and visit seagulls. And to him, it was an act of friendship to take some breadcrumbs and toss them on a strand so they'd flock to him. There wasn't any arguing with him that feeding the wildlife was not a great idea. He'd simply collect more and more stale bread for the gulls. I dream about him. He was larger than life. He wasn't the least bit interested in conforming to most social standards. Not until the last decade of his life did have any use for God talk, and then he became quite spiritually alert and aware and deep. If he related to any archetype, it was that of the pirate. There was a restaurant somewhere near where he lived called Drunken Jack's, and I think he thought of himself as Drunken Jack the pirate. He went through something like 8 and ersatz marriages and was a disaster in his family life. But in the courtroom, he was a star, almost never, ever losing a case that he prosecuted. One of those cases was a celebrated case of a double murder, and it was made into a movie that starred William Conrad as Jim Dunn, and they could not have picked somebody that looked less like or acted less like Jim Dunn to play that role. Few years before he died, I'd go to the beach to visit our parents, and Jim, who lived not too far away, and I would go to one of his favorite haunts called the Blue Marlin, which was a nightclub that had live music, and it was a favorite hangout of the locals. And he danced and glad-handed everybody, and was at that point in his life as handsome a 68-year-old as he had ever been when he was like 28, relatively speaking, of course. His coal black hair never turned gray. He was and still is a legend. I live now a continent away from where Jim and I were born, where he rode me to Sunday school on his motorbike, believe it or not, where in high school he worked on cars, where he humiliated me when I was about 14 when I made some smart ass comment and he took a handful of stewed squash on the dinner table and just rubbed it into my face because I pissed him off. He's buried in the sandy soil of Lakeside Cemetery in Conway, and he is alive in my soul, a piece of me that I have at times found amusing, sometimes confusing. Somewhere in this mix lie some clues about brotherhood. Brotherly love sounds so idealistic, so abstract, so aspirational, not at all pragmatic or realistic. Brothers fight, struggle, grow apart, sometimes are alienated from each other, and yet there are times when differences actually strengthen the bonds of brotherhood. And like Dostoevsky's famed Brothers Karamazov, fraternity constellates a part of itself in each brother, bearing some fragment of the wholeness that together they all share. And so it was with Jim and me. I was in high school when he was in law school. He was my mentor, my model in so many ways. Once when I was pouring out my adolescent heart to him and telling him about my problems and so forth, his response was, "You are a solution looking for a problem." His words grabbed me, essentially daring me to get on with being who I was. And I had no idea at the time what that might be. These decades later, I realized perhaps what he didn't. We already are what we must become. We already have everything we need. Now, when I'm near the seashore or a lake or a river or lolling about in our pool, I'll remember the floats and umbrellas of 1957 and hear a voice commanding, "Swim to the buoy! Swim to the buoy!" And I press on towards something that is always just beyond my reach.